The five eras theory is one of the theories that I use to try to formulate and visualize how the lands could have looked in the past. We have no idea what the actual history is. Yes, we're given a historical account, but we have many inconsistencies in it and we see many contradictions. The portion of the five eras theory that I bring up here, though, is dividing it up into looking into how our civilization came to where it is. We start with the Golden Age. And the Golden Age consists of the first three eras. Now, there are many cultures that have a division of five eras that are across the land, and this is the reason why I picked five eras. I don't know. There could be many more, there could be many less. Many things were possible in the Golden Age. Human beings were much more advanced and much more developed spiritually, and they could achieve great architectural achievements. I also believe that in the third era is where the star fort builders came from. We're now in our contemporary age, or what others might call the Iron Age, or we jokingly refer to as the Plastic Age. And we call it that because everything is very disposable. And it seems as though we can feel internally that this era that we live in now does not match what was in the past. Although we'll be ridiculed for this, even though there's a lot of evidence that suggests otherwise. Today we're going to be looking at the Tartarian Age, or the fourth era. Now, I call this the Tartarian Age, and there are many alternative researchers that are saying we shouldn't be using this term all the time. It's just a name that's associated with it, a worldwide civilization that existed before our own. But what did it really look like? Well, we have to go back and revisualize the other eras. The first era, the Golden Age, where pretty much anything was possible, where human beings lived exceptionally long lifetimes, and they had an infinite spiritual health. They understood themselves, they understood their environment, and they existed in a wonderful balance with it. Not the promises of balances, but true balances. And their architectural achievements were stunning. They could build buildings that reached to the very clouds, and who knows, perhaps the very nature of the land is very different than we can imagine. It's not just buildings, it could have been vast flora and fauna that existed. And there's a reason why they try to tie this in with explanations of things existing many millions of years ago. But who knows what the actual timeline is? Was this first era of the Golden Age 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago? We don't really have any way to know. And the only remnants we see of this are in great rocks and in certain areas of the land where we have hints of once great buildings that existed in the very distant past. Or maybe it wasn't such a distant past after all, because the forces that destroyed these buildings and leveled the land are things that we cannot understand. But we can certainly speculate on them. The whole point behind the first era of the Golden Age is to understand that in the very beginning, we believe that human beings were exceptionally developed. Now, this theory could be completely wrong, but the evidence that backs it up is whenever you go across the land and you find evidence of melted buildings, vast structures that once covered the land. And on this channel, we explored the Castle Rock ruins in Wisconsin, and we saw that there were hints of vast structures that once existed there that had to be larger than we could possibly imagine. We also see structures such as Devil's Tower. It may have once been a large tree, or it may have once been a large structure, or something else. In the second era, we postulate a civilization that existed, rising from the ashes of the first era. Now, others may call this the Silver Age, and we'll review what this really was when we look at the Greek theory of the five ages. However, the second era, this is where we suspect the pyramid builders really came from. And we think of the original pyramids, or the Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau. They were simply smaller satellite pyramids. We have evidence of much larger pyramids that are built across the land. And in my theories on this channel, I believe that this came from a second era, or a civilization that was still in a golden age, but in a different portion of a golden age. They constructed pyramids because it was a geometrically sound structure, and it also showed their connection to the land. And we don't fully understand what kind of technology that was available both in the construction of these pyramids, and then how they factored into the overall society and the use of such technology. But we suspect that these buildings also developed the internal human being. They supported the spiritual health of the person, and not just provided a structure for societal use. It's a very interesting balance to think of. A building that serves society, but at the same time serves the individual. It seems as though our modern buildings oftentimes deprive us of our spiritual health, and they're very, how shall we say, not even remotely aesthetically pleasing. They're just there to be there and serve a function. The third era, which is another era and the last era of the Golden Age, that followed the pyramid builders. And this was an era where we believed that the civilization advanced to building the great star forts, where they could manipulate the land and the structures and integrate them accordingly. No one really knows what heights this civilization reached, but we can speculate that they had tremendous capabilities to build towers to the very sky. They also had the ability to form and shape the land in geometrical configurations that endure to this day. We can see the remnants of this civilization everywhere we look across the lands. There are star forts everywhere. There are also star forts that are integrated in the very land. We also have the theories about how the land is shaped in many places, where we see large sandbars that extend for many miles on the coasts in many lands across the realm. Now we look at our current era, the fifth era, the plastic age, and we see that none of what it is really compares to what we had in the past. We have tall towers of glass and steel, yet they give the impression of being very cheap and disposable. They also show us the fact that our civilization just seems to be something that's readily thrown away and can be thrown away. We also have to remember that we have many, many images of destruction from films, television shows. But today we're going to look specifically at the fourth era, the Tartarian civilization, or the civilization that preceded ours. We want to get an idea of what heights they reached, what was the maximum extent of their capabilities. Because this is the civilization that we see the most defined and detailed remnants of, such as the Iowa State Capitol, the many other beautiful state capitol buildings, the Art Deco buildings, all these buildings that we look at and all these city explorations that we do, they reflect the remnants of the fourth era. Now, let's look at the Tartarian fourth era civilization. And remember, Tartaria is just a term that I assigned to it. The civilization could have been called something completely different. Here's a possible timeline. Break it down into 3 eras, if you will, or 3 portions, 3 phases. An inception and a rising phase, an ascendancy in the height of their civilization, and then a decline and a fall. How long were each of these phases of this Tartarian civilization? We just don't know. They could be 1,000 years. They could be 100 years. We seem to have a great obsession with 1,000 years, and it's probably because it's a nice round number. What did this really look like, though? The main component of this theory is we have to consider the society that existed in this worldwide civilization, their culture, their values, their capabilities, and then ultimately their vulnerabilities. How was it they fell? When they rose, it was clear that they had remnants of the previous era, the third era. But we suspect that the third era endured a great reset or some sort of cataclysm. Looking at what this civilization looked like during its height, we have to think on the integration potentially of pyramid buildings, great towers and domes that reach to the very sky. They had energy capabilities and the ability to generate energy, both from the atmosphere, and then we've also speculated that they had some sort of crystal power source. They may have had many other sources of energy that they were able to draw from, because it's energy that allowed them to build a great society and civilization. Yet at the same time, we speculate that they had a balance that they achieved between the society and the individual. Harvesting this energy may have well reflected that balance in the fact that they were able to understand the energy that they could harvest from both the land and the very air in the atmosphere, and at the same time the energy that existed beneath the land. It seems as though this gave them the capability, along with their developed cultural and societal understanding, to achieve great constructions beyond our wildest dreams. We only see the bare bones remnants of many of these wonderful structures. Think on the fact that we have diagrams and sketches that show us these incredible buildings at their very height. Yet we take this to even what many would consider a science fiction imaging or imagery of what the society may have looked like at their very height. They had airships, they had vast tall buildings across the land. They had cities that stretched for many, many miles, much larger than the cities that we see today. And their structures were built to be enduring, to last. And of course you'll ask, well, exactly how did such a large signature of such a civilization fall? Why is it not with us? We don't understand the capabilities that were used to destroy it. We suspect that there was some sort of force or threat that arose in the land that either defeated the civilization internally or externally. A lot of the hints that we have, though, indicate that it was defeated internally. Initially in the conflict, the civilization won in an external conflict. Now, what do we mean by an internal conflict? This adversary found some sort of way to infiltrate the very beings of people and turn them against the civilization. We look at the great beauty at the very height, imagining a civilization that was in total balance. And it's not just the balance between society and the individual, it's also the understanding of the many cultural groups that no doubt existed in this civilization. They were able to exist in a harmonious nature. And we might reflect on the fact that it seems as though everything in our current civilization operates to turn us against each other through any visual difference or any sort of difference, be it a perceived economic, political, or whatever, to keep us at each other's throats. We look at some of the other possibilities of the previous civilization. Great airships with no limits in their traveling capacity. Great airships that could travel the land very quickly and efficiently. There's been a lot of speculation about airplanes recently, and perhaps the reality behind airplanes and jets is that they use some remnant of this technology, and that's why they appear to take off and land so slowly, almost as though they're hovering in a way and they don't operate in the manner that we're told. Yet we look at these great images of these airships and their vast hangars, and again we still see the remnants of this technology scattered across the land. This is what will be shown airship hangars looked like in the 1920s. The fact being, though, is that this did really exist. It causes us to question if the capacity behind this, though, is far greater than we're shown. That this is merely the bare bones remnants of it, the only portions of the technology that they could return to operational capacity. It's interesting to me that we even have accounts that question the existence and the veracity of these airships docking with tall buildings and tall structures. Some cities, such as Tulsa, even completely deny the account that an airship ever docked with any tall structure in the city. Yet there are other accounts within the history of aviation that shows that this is very true, and this was far more commonplace than they'd like us to think now. We consider the fact that there's been a very defined attack on airships. Now we visualize the decline of this previous civilization. If we suspect that they won a physical external war against some unknown enemy, we have to realize that the unknown enemy changed its tactics and infiltrated the civilization itself by corrupting human beings from the inside. As a result, they began to corrupt the very facets that kept the civilization propped up, considering the fact that the civilization was based on an effective government that actually worked in the interests of the people. That was probably one of the first things that changed. The government then became self-serving, or serving the purposes and intentions of the exterior force that infiltrated it. Therefore, they began to turn the civilization against one another, emphasizing every single physical, social, and economic difference, whether they were real or not. Even the perceived differences, the ideals, caused these people to begin to distrust one another, and gradually their civilization began to erode from the inside out. The great buildings were no longer maintained, the energy systems were neglected. People began to even question their once great purpose in life, and achieving the very pinnacle of human being. They began to turn away from that. And you can find evidence in that in every single account from every civilization and culture that exists on the land today, that people were corrupted. Eventually, it became a point to where this civilization could no longer defend itself from an external threat, and either using some natural cataclysm, or perhaps an unnatural cataclysm, an artificial attack using weapons beyond our greatest imagination, they were able to destroy and wreck many of the greatest structures of the civilization that preceded ours. And we have numerous stories of destruction of great edifices in the past, wondrous cities that were reduced to nothing, melted to ash and rubble, and we really don't see any remnants of it today. We think that perhaps the great fires that we read about that seem to dot every single city in the 19th century may have been the finalized destruction of the great structures that remained. We also consider the fact that we have many tales from both biblical and mainstream accounts of vast destruction in the past, even as recently as the 20th century, considering the Tunguska event in Siberia, and even the destruction of the Bronx, which occurred supposedly as late as the 1970s and the early 1980s. Yet the concept of fire from the sky is something that we have to take a lot more seriously. There had to be some great force that was employed, and that's how many of the greatest structures that once existed were utterly annihilated. And here's an image of what remains of the Castle Rock ruins, as I called it, in Wisconsin. Yet you can see it's the remnants of once great buildings. Now I suspect that this is from an earlier era, but this could be as recently as the last era, the Fourth Era, or the Tartarian civilization. We just don't know. So we have to operate on speculation and try to put the pieces together to put together the overall story of what really happened. And why do I suspect that these ruins are much older and are actually the ruins of these great buildings? Well, it's because of the fact that you can't really get an idea of the structures, but you still see signs of symmetry in these ruins. And these signs of symmetry and the vast magnitude that they reflected had to be the once great structures of the First Era. The structures that reached to the very clouds, the legends that we have of such edifices as the Tower of Babel. Yet there are many other accounts that indicate that there were once very large structures that existed, again through societies and cultures across the land, and we'll be told it was merely the work of the gods. This is a idealized depiction of the Golden Age from the Greek account of the Golden Age, and they have a different breakdown of the 5 eras, or the 5 portions of civilization. The Golden Age, the human beings lived amongst the gods, they lived for hundreds of years, and their spirits endured even after they died. They never grew old. Now, is that a reality, or is that just something that we're told to convince us to believe in it? It's ultimately up for you to decide. Of course, now we'll be told that a golden age can be reached again with our technology, and we've always been promised this great future. Although as time passes, we see that no great future is ever delivered to us. We can see that our society continues to grow more disposable. It continues to be something that just feels as though that the quality of service and the quality of life is decreasing. Of course, you'll be told that you're wrong and the quality of life is increasing. However, anybody who has any self-awareness and is capable of thinking for themselves can see that the quality of life is declining. It's not the Garden of Eden. It's not this idealized existence. That just seems to be a false promise that we're given in our current state of being. Did it exist in the past? Well, it must have, because we have accounts of it. And we are constantly detracted or deterred from even trying to visualize this. And we are not encouraged to think that this existed in the past. As though someone doesn't want us to even be able to visualize how great society can be. We have numerous depictions and allusions to things such as a fountain of youth. And why is that so alluring to us? Why is it we fear aging and death so much? Even in the Golden Age, death was a part of life. Apparently aging was not, according to the accounts that we have. Now, whether they're true or not is irrelevant. We still have this perception that the fear of life comes from the ultimate fear of death and the fear of aging. And you can see many examples of how both these fears are used time and time again. We also have accounts of great civilizations that may or may not have existed, such as the legendary kingdom of Prester John. We're told that this was merely a myth that motivated European explorers to go across the land and try to attempt to locate what they believed was an ally to Christendom in the distant past. Yet, looking at some of the accounts of Prester John, it almost feels as though we're given accounts of a remnant or an enclave, an organized enclave of the Tartarian civilization or the Fourth Era that somehow survived the reset and continued to exist and may have existed much closer to the contemporary era than we like to think. Naturally, it was targeted and destroyed over time, and perhaps these are what the great campaigns or the massive reset war that we speculated occurred in the 19th century may have been all about destroying. These enclaves that existed across the land, and perhaps the enclave of Prester John, or whatever the real name was of the individual or society that existed there. Yet looking around, we still see many of the bare bones remnants of the previous civilization, and it's everywhere. Such as here in New Orleans, where you'll see a lot of accounts and a lot of images that show that great advanced buildings existed there. Defenders of the mainstream account will tell us, well, it was simply part of the great French presence that existed in North America and that they forfeited it when they sold it as part of the Louisiana Purchase because of the Napoleonic Wars, which are a very questionable event in and of themselves. Yet we see many of these buildings, and while they may be smaller in scale, we suspect that these buildings are the remnants of the previous civilization, that they reflected their greatness. Now, this is a building that supposedly preceded the Art Deco era in Cleveland, and yet we see such beauty and amazing architectural achievement with it, with the pediment and the columns, and even the height and the beauty and the artistic desire of it. Perhaps this was just a small administrative building that existed in the previous civilization, or the Marble Room going back to Cleveland. A beautiful, amazing place to dine, which, again, displays the connection between a society and an individual. A place where you can go and interact with other individuals and at the same time feel your internal being strengthened just by being present in this room. And during the exploration of this particular room, I joked that even a McDonald's hamburger would taste like fine dining if you had this kind of atmosphere and environment that you're eating it in. We also see the remaining state capitals, and we have no doubt that these are clearly the remaining buildings of the previous civilization. Perhaps they were low-level administration buildings, or they were regional administration buildings that survived whatever targeted effects of the last reset occurred. Whether that was some sort of artificial weapon, a directed energy weapon, or some other power means that we don't understand. Perhaps the very technology of the previous civilization was subverted and used against it, which we speculated was cymatics. We see images of the current age, also called the Iron Age, or what we call the Plastic Age, which states that people are born with gray hair, that people age rapidly, and they live a very harsh lifestyle, and that the only people who aspire to greatness are the people who are the most proficient at lying. And we see a lot of truth in this. We see a lot of truth in this in our contemporary society and also in the accounts that we have of the past, where a society or a civilization is subverted by its own ruthless desires. We also think of all the images that we have of utterly destroyed cities, which again reinforces the notion that the previous civilization was completely annihilated, that many of their great buildings were destroyed, and only certain buildings managed to survive this reset. Of course, this is from St. Louis, and we have a mainstream account that's utterly silly in my mind, that a steamboat or a paddle steamer started this fire because it crashed into other boats on the river, and then it crashed into buildings somehow and started a great conflagration. We also have the Chicago fire, and we see immense images of apocalyptic destruction from the Chicago fire. Somehow the city was quickly built in a short period of time. The Chicago fire occurred in the 1870s, and then they quickly rebuilt it, to the point to where they were ready to have the greatest World's Fair of all time in the 1890s. Now, if you want to believe this mainstream account, that's entirely up to you, and maybe you think this is credible. Maybe you think these kind of amazing feats in logistics are possible because people worked hard, and if they didn't work hard, they starved and they died. Yet I find this account very hard to believe, and I find it much more likely that these are images of the last phases of destruction of the previous civilization, where they were targeting any buildings that would be too difficult to explain, or buildings that they could not convincingly repurpose and put in a presupposed narrative. Now, yes, we say narrative, and that term gets a lot of derisive attitude towards it, and rightfully so. However, it is a narrative. It is an account that we're supposed to believe. And the whole point behind it is to cause us to not have any understanding of our true history. Because if we don't know our true history, then we don't know our true identity. Our identity can be shaped to whatever power that truly rules the land wants our identity to be. We're simply nothing. We're creatures who have no greater spiritual health or existence, and we exist for their very pleasure, to be used and discarded as soon as we're done. And they'll openly admit this too in mainstream accounts. Yet we look back to the Golden Age, and we realize that there was something much greater. There are accounts that our civilization and our people and our identity was much greater in the distant past. That's the real purpose behind these explorations. It's a journey inward to rediscover the strength that lies within every human being. That's why my approach is not to tell you what to think. You have to decide for yourself what to think. You have to decide for yourself what to believe, who to listen to, and what's really true and real and what's not. And I'm not ever going to insult anyone by insulting what they believe, and if you believe the mainstream account is correct, well then go ahead. It's not going to bother me whatsoever. However, going back to the previous age, there's no doubt that it seemed to be a return to the glories of the distant past. At its very height, the Tartarian age did reach that, with a balance between society and the individual, with a true cultural understanding. Perhaps the story of the Tower of Babel is not so distant or legendary as we like to think. Perhaps it's not reflecting the differences in languages, but simply reflecting the differences in civilizations and cultures, as they've now been inherently divided and are encouraged to be divided by the current ruling powers of the lands. Because it's a lot easier to retain control when you keep people divided. You keep them unaware of what their past is. They live in a state of amnesia, or much worse, they live with a fabricated past. And that's the question people always ask. Why would anybody go to the trouble of doing this? Because you can achieve total control. Now, we haven't really explored who the enemy is, or who really caused all this, the previous fall of civilization and humanity. We're going to explore that in an upcoming video on this channel called The Ancient Enemy. There's going to be some theories involved, but there is a lot of evidence, and that evidence is found in the current actions that we witness every day in the land, for how people are divided, how people may be subverted from within, and what's the true nature of the external threat. Remember that these buildings still exist. They are everywhere. And this is hard evidence that a previous civilization existed. You can go to the Iowa State Capitol, you can touch the internal walls and the external walls, and you can see that this is all true material. It is real and it is still with us everywhere. That's important to remember as we continue our exploration. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Through our explorations in the last several months on this channel, we've seen incredible buildings across the land. Buildings that defy simple explanation and inspire our imagination. We've looked into the origin of these buildings and we've explored many details about them. We've also looked at the conflicts that have given rise to our land and the current age that we live in. And yet these buildings continue to persist, a reminder of a long-forgotten glory. We see incredible achievements that we know we could never match today, although we're assured that several of our architects and our capabilities could do it with simple financial resources. Yet these buildings tell a very different story. The fact that they were all constructed during the same time frame in the United States defies the original given account that we have about them being built over the past 1,000 years. But what's the real story that we have? On this channel, we have the 5 eras theory, where we consider the true account of humanity. That there were 5 eras of human existence, 5 civilizations. Today, we're going to be starting the story of looking at Tartaria, or the 4th era civilization, the civilization that preceded ours. On this channel, we assign the name Tartaria to refer to it, but we don't know what the actual name of this civilization was. In the video Pax Tartaria, we looked at what Tartaria could really look like. And now we're going to look to tell the story of Tartaria. How can we tell a story about events that we have no knowledge of? I believe that we have many clues and indications in our given account that tell us exactly what happened and give us many clues for what transpired in the previous civilization, how it rose, how it reached its ascendancy, and how it fell. We look at the first era, the Golden Age, and while we have no direct reflections of the Golden Age, we know it happened. We do have accounts in many of our myth about the incredible edifices, towers that were built to reach the heavens, structures that we can't even begin to imagine to this day. The remnants do still exist. We can still see the bare bones evidence that these structures did once inhabit the land. But what do they look like? And what accounts do we have of these structures? Consider the Tower of Babel. Consider the account that in many different cultures, there are mythical stories that allude to towers that reach the heavens. Perhaps in this image we see the remains of such a tower that reached to the heavens. Many people will consider it an absurd possibility that this image you're looking at is the remnants of a foundation of such an incredible tower. Yet it's entirely possible. Because if it's such an absurd notion, then why does it always have to be attacked and discredited? Why does it seem like people don't even want you to ask questions or have alternate considerations about things? Why is it such a threat if these are hard, objective facts? There's always such an intense emotional response to what people consider fact, and yet their devotion to fact becomes dogmatic. We consider the second era, the next civilization that followed the first civilization, in the golden era of humanity, which was the first 3 eras. The second era we saw pyramid builders, and we speculate that this was the civilization that achieved its ascendancy in building pyramids. And we see remnants of these pyramids all over the land, even the Great Pyramid in Bosnia, which of course we'll be told is merely a natural structure, and once again there has to be a lot of devotion to discrediting it as a natural structure. The third era, where we posit are the Star Fort builders, another great civilization that managed to manipulate the geometry of the land while maintaining a delicate balance with nature. They built the great star forts with incredible towers. Perhaps a legend of the Tower of Babel came from this era. or maybe it was from an earlier era. Despite the fact that we have myths that overlap, and we have accounts that seem somewhat conflicted, there are consistencies that we can find. If you examine the myth, and if you look at your own intuition, you can find that the civilization that preceded ours, the Fourth Era, the era that we call Tartaria, ascended to great wonders in their architectural capability, while at the same time they also reflected the same traits that we saw in the earlier civilization, achieving a wondrous balance between the individual and society, and between the artificial constructs of society and nature. While once again this notion will be ridiculed, why does it have to be ridiculed? Isn't that what we're looking for? And yet we look at our own contemporary era, the Fifth Era, the Plastic Age, the Iron Age, the age where it seems as though people have descended to simply settling for what they're told is the best that they can have. People who no longer look inward, people who no longer face their internal struggles, but simply look for others to solve their problems and issues for them, and simply look to blame others for every single challenge that they have in life. They don't seek to work together, and they don't seek to achieve a balance, both internally and with their society. They simply operate in terms of currency, and oftentimes this currency is merely an ideal. When we look at the five eras theory and the possible timelines, we have the Golden Age with the first three eras that we saw depictions of. We have the Tartarian Age, or the Fourth Era, and then we have our contemporary age. In these series of explorations that the channel will be embarking on in the next several weeks, we're going to specifically examine the civilization that preceded ours, the Fourth Era of the Tartarian Age. We're going to examine how it rose, which is the topic of this video. We're going to look at its ascendancy, and then we're also going to consider how it fell and how it led us to come to the contemporary age. And while many of these aspects are based on theory, there is a lot of evidence that supports a lot of these conclusions. Now, where does this evidence come from? I believe that there are truths that are embedded in our given history and also within our myth. Because when you step back far enough and you look at the whole picture, you can find the way that the pieces fit together. The way that they fit together that tell the actual account of the true history of humanity. Now, of course, the powers that be enjoy the fact that we are confused and that we only have bits of information that are conflicted and mixed and scattered. And yet we see that at the end of the Third Era, we had achieved the great construction of star forts, and there is evidence of these star forts that continue to this day. Not small military posts that were merely enclaves to position cannons, but large cities. Once the society collapsed and the civilization was destroyed in a hard reset, it gave birth to the Fourth Era, the Tartarian civilization. We'll be looking at that specifically, and we're going to consider exactly how it began and how the roots of its beginning were actually found in the remnants of the civilization of the Third Era. Looking at images of the Third Era, we have things that defy our imagination. Incredible structures, an incredible civilization that spanned the entire world. It was unified in purpose, and yet at the same time it had achieved a fine balance in its existence and in the conduct of its society. We will always be told that such a consideration for a civilization being unified in purpose is absurd. It's a notion that seems alien to us because we think of our own contemporary civilization where we have divided nations and we have divisions inflicted on the human species in every way imaginable. Whether it's what we think, it's how we believe, or how we live. And these divisions are reinforced in every day and every news broadcast that we have. Yet imagine such a beautiful civilization where people could exist in balance. Some people may consider this a terrifying notion, that these people were able to live in close quarters and yet at the same time be prosperous. Yet we have every indication that they could, at least until the hard reset at the end of the Third Era occurred. We're not exactly certain what happened, but we refer to this event either as a flame deluge or fire from the sky that completely destroyed the civilization. We have a lot of evidence of melted structures across the land, and if you go to locations such as Cappadocia, Turkey, you will see where this has transpired. The result being that the civilization of the Third Era was completely destroyed. The star fort builders had their structures eradicated by the fire. The foundations remain, and we still have many remnants of the cities and the patterns on which they were built, the remnants of the destruction by fire. Yet we question what occurred with the civilization. Were there remnants of it that managed to break off into pockets of survival that persisted through this flame deluge? There seems to be a lot of evidence that there were remnants. Were they smaller civilizations themselves, isolated settlements, or perhaps even the real indications that we have with the isolated monasteries that were told in our own official account that survived and managed to thrive off the grid while preserving the knowledge of the previous civilization. Consider a science fiction story called A Canticle for Leibowitz, a story that gives us the concept of the psychic existence of humanity, where we constantly see the civilization destroyed by different aspects available to it. Now, granted, this is a civilization that destroyed itself. Yet, when we look at the rise of Tartaria, we're looking at a civilization that rose from the ashes of a previous civilization. It's suffice to say that the fourth era rose from the remnants of the third era. But it seems that this was so effective because vast quantities of knowledge were preserved from the third era. And as a result, the civilization that rose that became Tartaria had access to this. What efforts had actually preserved this knowledge? Well, based on what we have in our own official historical account, we know that there were isolated pockets or survivors who had preserved knowledge of the previous civilization. And it wasn't simply the knowledge of the building processes, the existence of the society, and the technologies that they used to flourish. It was also simply the awareness of the society. Because the true fundamental belief of people in themselves comes from their understanding of what civilization they had, how they fit within it, but then also an awareness of the individual. That is the fine balance that we had in the past. So even though there were great, terrifying ruins from the hard reset of the end of the third era, the Starfort Builders civilization, we can see that there were the foundations in its destruction that would lead to the rise of another great civilization in the fourth era, the civilization that we refer to as Tartaria. Now, is this name appropriate? Perhaps not. Perhaps there is a much more encompassing name that would be more fitting. But consider the order that preserved civilization, the survivors of the third era, those that still had the knowledge of how that society functioned, the basic knowledges of the sciences that they had achieved that were preserved, the technological level. It must have been a difficult struggle, and they endured on isolated outposts and compounds, many of the remnants that we still see today. Compounds that had to survive roving bands of survivors and other great challenges. Lack of supplies, lack of access to water and food. The simple struggle for survival had to consume their daily lives. Yet despite the struggle for survival, they preserved knowledge. And they managed to do so in a way that allowed the future civilization of Tartaria to rise, having access to the knowledge and awareness of the previous civilizations. Think on how fundamentally powerful that would be to have access to previous civilizations, to simply be aware of what the true account of events that preceded you really were. Because all you have to do is compare the account that we're given, and you can find vast inconsistencies. Even in the accounts that were given of very recent events that only occurred even in the last few years and a few decades ago. You don't have to go very far back in our given historical account to find vast inconsistencies, whether it's in what we're actually told or the images that we have, or both. When you look at it in totality, you see that there are so many inconsistencies that you simply have to be someone who accepts what they're told without question to accept the given historical narrative that we have. And while that term is often derided, that's exactly what it is. Now, does that mean that we're seeking to replace it with another historical narrative? We are seeking to find the truth. The truth of what our actual history is. Although history is often a misnomer in and of itself, we are looking to understand who we are, what we're about, and what our past truly was. because it's knowledge of the past that enabled the previous civilization to rise to such great heights. Once again, many people will deride those who seek to live a greater life or seek to have more. And yet, no doubt, there were many survivors from the collapse of the Third Era who wandered the land and thought about having a greater life. Having a greater life where they could achieve balance. A balance with nature and a balance of the individual with his society. They struggled through many great difficulties and hardships, living in the ruins of what remained of their civilization, while at the same time, many retained both the knowledge and the spirit that had made the Third Era the civilization of dreams to us. It seems as though the concept of division is something that's fundamentally induced within our society now. Every day we're reminded and reinforced of how and why we should be divided, and why the cause of all of our daily problems is some other random group of people for whatever reason. And oftentimes we'll be given very flimsy accounts of evidence for this. Yet in the past it seems as though once the Fourth Era started, people began to look within themselves, and they saw the flaws that they had. They understood and appreciated the flaws that they had as individuals. We all have flaws. I have flaws. You have flaws. And if you're viewing this video, you are someone who seeks to improve their own life. But not just their own life, but to dream and conceptualize a civilization to where we could actually live in balance with one another and live in balance with nature. That's frequently the offer that we have from our current civilization. And yet oftentimes we see that we never come close to making any progress towards that. Imagine a civilization in balance between the nature and the individual. This is what rose with Tartaria in the Fourth Era. They were able to rebuild many of the lost structures, and while they may not have replicated the advances and achievements of the past, they did achieve stunning advancements in a different sort of architecture. And you can see this in how the structures that they built remain to this day. We know that they're different than the star fort builders of the Third Era, and yet they built on top of the foundations. And in many places we still see the remnants and the signs of the great star fort cities. Their beautiful, intricate layouts, suggesting a technology and an integration with nature that exceeds our wildest imagination to this day. But the evidence is still there. Their appearances dot the landscape. These are not simply small military forts or bastions from some conflict that occurred 200 to 300 years ago. These are entire cities that are laid out on these elaborate and intricate star fort structures that show a knowledge of geometry that surpasses the application within an integration of nature that we can't begin to imagine. But it was possible. And you don't just see it in cities, you also see it in vast aspects of the landscape. And that is exactly what Tartaria had and understood that they were able to build on top of. They were able to integrate a lot of the aspects and achievements of their civilization, their structures, on top of the previous civilization. It was a fundamental figurative and literal presentation of how far Tartaria was able to go. Ironically, there is a parallel within our given historical account, and that's of the rise of Rome and Greece. We're told that from this period that we're told is antiquity, that these two civilizations, which were separate yet somehow amalgamated, managed to achieve great and stunning architecture, and that they're the ones to be credited with the remnants of all the columns, the pillars, the pediments, and all the beautiful architecture that we see. And we'll ask how was it done, and we'll be told that despite the fact that their civil society was fundamentally corrupt and flawed, that they practiced slavery, it was simply due to their hard, darkened will that they managed to drive individuals in slavery to build these incredible edifices. Yet these edifices are across the land. And we're told finally that after a period of dark ages or a medieval period, our civilization, the one that we believe in, that we're given in our historical account, came from a renaissance. Yet we see so many fundamental conflicts in the actual society and the values. Consider the story of Gawain and the Green Knight, one of the fundamental Arthurian legends. This is a story that's long been with us, and the theme is quite simple. That an individual who aspires to be a perfect human being and live by a perfect set of rules finds that they cannot be perfect. The most definitive evidence of this is in the Green Sash, where Gawain, the knight, who embarks upon the quest after he encounters the Green Knight who shows up and offers any knight in Arthur's court the chance to swing at his head with an axe, which Gawain takes up the challenge, knocks off the Green Knight's head, which the Green Knight simply picks up and puts back on. A year later, Gawain has to receive a return blow. He's taken in by the house of a noble, and at that noble's house, he is given numerous gifts which he has to share with the noble, to include the affections of the nobleman's wife. Gawain is honest and true and shares everything with the nobleman whose house he stays at. However, because Gawain loves life, he realizes that he's not a perfect man, as he does not tell his noble the gift that his wife gave him of the green sash. His wife telling him that the green sash would protect him and preserve his life when he received the return blow at the hands of the Green Knight. The real theme behind the story, though, is that we are not perfect. Yet the Arthurian legend shows an ideal versus a reality. We're told that during the Dark Ages, during the medieval times of our own civilization that we believe in, most of us do with our given historical account, that oftentimes it was simply an ideal, that there was really no such thing as chivalry, that there was no such thing as honor, and there was certainly no such thing as decency between human beings. People would murder each other, people would go off on vast crusades, jihads, or whatever holy war term that they had at the time, and commit acts of genocide, all in the name of furthering their own civilization and their own belief. Yet is this really the account that occurred, or is this just simply what we're told? We have to consider the fact that what we're told is oftentimes to incite a response in all of us, to control our thoughts, to control our actions. If we look at the reality of the Arthurian legend of Gawain and the Green Knight, we see that there is a power in recognizing the flaws within ourselves. Because if we're able to recognize our own flaws, if we're able to perceive them, it's through that means that we're able to avoid the repeated mistakes that we've had in the past. It's by that awareness that we're able to achieve something so much more. We're able to achieve a unification within our society and our civilization, an understanding for all the differences that make us unique and make us special at the same time. This is considered a grave threat to the current powers that be, and we'll see that in our current civilization that every theme behind it is to prevent this from happening, to prevent us from understanding each other. You can even see it in the legend of the Tower of Babel, with the fact that a unified humanity was perceived to be a great threat. But we're never told why it was perceived to be a great threat. We're simply told that people being able to accomplish anything and having no limits on their achievements is a threat, and it must be stopped. Therefore, go down and confuse their languages. Confuse. Is it really a concept, though, a literal translation of speaking different languages? Or is it simply a matter of losing understanding? It's always interesting to me how we criticize and castigate relentlessly each other, those of us who don't feel the same way or those of us who don't think the same way. And yet oftentimes these are for the most bare bones and superficial differences that don't matter 5 minutes after a conversation is completed. We see the remnants, though, of the Arthurian legend spread out across the lands of what is now the United Kingdom. Even Arthur's Rock in Edinburgh, Scotland, you can still see the beautiful remnants of what may have been the glories of the past. Consider the possibility that Arthur was a real figure, not someone who fought wars of unification in the United Kingdom, but perhaps a great leader of the previous Tartarian civilization, someone who rose and held the people that they had under their charge to a higher standard, and challenged them to look within and be aware of the flaws that they had as individuals, and as a result achieve that balance that they once had between the individual and society, and also in integrating the artificial concepts of their society with nature. This is why you see a much more defined and inspiring building style in the past. These were the great achievements of the eras that came before us, and these are the achievements which many view as very threatening, and it seems as though there are many powers that work to prevent us from even perceiving this or questioning what they tell us is our given historical account. Then there's also the legend of Prester John, another myth that will be told. And yet, is this a myth that's based on religion? Or was Prester John the true leader of a surviving enclave of civilization from the Third Era that survived into the Fourth Era? I think that's the grave difference, though, between going from the Third Era or the Star Fort builders to the Fourth Era. And then it becomes another matter of add text. We have no story. We have no history. Therefore, whatever history we have is that which is given to us. And why would someone do this? It's a very simple explanation. Because if you can tell people exactly what to think, if you can tell them exactly what happened in the past, such as in this case where the Tartarian Empire has become an official conspiracy theory, according to Wikipedia. And we remember on this channel we talked about Brian Dunning. He's the primary wiki reference. We featured him in the previous video considering the mud flood on this channel.
Hello, my name is Brian Dunning. I was born in Southern California in 1965.
In August 2008, eBay filed suit against Dunning, accusing him of defrauding eBay and eBay affiliates. Dunning was sentenced in August 2014 to 15 months in prison, a result of his company receiving between $200,000 and $400,000 in fraudulent commissions from eBay. Dunning stated that he is innocent. He only agreed to the settlement because he could not afford to continue the legal battle. Source for this is Wikipedia. So this is our primary source, Brian Dunning. It seems as though he's implying that justice in the United States is based on monetary value, that you need money to have a favorable result. Why, that sounds like a conspiracy theory. And if Brian Dunning is really a conspiracy theorist, and how he considers the fact that Tartaria is a conspiracy theory, there's only one way to deal with him. And we know how they prefer to deal with him.
If there's any more shooting, Dr. Sayers, you'll be the first to go.
The purpose of this exploration has been to consider how Tartaria rose from the ashes of the Third Era. Why is Tartaria and the concept of it important to us today? We'll be derided for saying that things were better in the past. But this isn't about wanting things to be better in the past. This is about understanding it so we can have a better future. And whatever you believe that better future is, it's important to have awareness. And it's important to recognize that we are individuals with flaws. We'll be told that the only reason our current civilization can't replicate the buildings of the past is simply a matter of money and effort. And there'll even be some that say that we can replicate it. However, the only thing they can do is replicate the buildings from the previous era. When you look at the great layouts of the star forts of the past, the way they integrated the artificial with the natural, you know this is something we cannot replicate today, and yet the evidence still exists out there. We will continue with the explorations of Tartaria. We've explored many aspects of Tartaria on this channel before. We've also done theory videos where we've looked at what Tartaria looked like prior to the last reset. This channel calls Tartaria as our fourth era, or the civilization that preceded our current civilization. We believe it reached great heights, heights that we can't even begin to imagine, with incredible airships and spectacular architecture and technology. And yet we can still see that Tartaria fell. What was the reason it fell? What were some of the challenges that it faced? We've posited a potential timeline for Tartaria, and we believe that there was a great conflict that occurred during its second phase of its civilization, or the ascendancy period, when Tartaria reached the very height of its civilization. What was really the nature of this conflict, and what gave us an indication that there was a great conflict that occurred? And how do we know that Tartaria prevailed in this conflict? This is a theory video, but I think it's an important theory video because we do have many signs around the lands and our remaining architectures, and we'll be examining our great monuments and the symbolism behind those monuments that indicate to us that there was a great conflict that occurred during the ascendancy phase of Tartaria. we still see the remnants everywhere we look of the architecture of this civilization that preceded ours. We'll be assured by our mainstream that this wondrous architecture was merely the results of hard work and the earlier phase of our own civilization. And yet there are so many signs in it that we just don't fully recognize. There are so many things that just don't seem to make sense or match what we're told their origin tends to be. For example, the great fortresses all across the lands that we're told were built during medieval times or even earlier, yet by people who didn't possess the wonders and the benefits of the so-called Industrial Revolution, people who lacked logistical capacity, and yet there seemed to be no limits behind what they could achieve if they simply focused their minds on it. At the same time, we're also going to consider the fact that many of these structures are without a doubt the remnants of the Tartarian civilization that preceded ours. The signs are in their architectural capacity, their remote location, and the fact that many of these structures simply cannot be explained, not even by our current methods, in the modern era after the Industrial Revolution. These are structures that were completed by a civilization that not only possessed a wondrous technological know-how, building capacity, and architecture that we can only begin to imagine, but they also had an incredible civilization and a society. In today's video, we're going to be exploring one of the greatest challenges that society faced, and the unified civilization of humanity in the past era managed to overcome. We're also going to speculate in terms of who the adversary was that they actually faced. And while we've explored that on the channel before, today's exploration is going to look a little deeper and try to posit some more theories on that aspect as we look at the Great Conflict and Tartaria's triumph. This is the monument to the Battle of the Nations. We're told it was built in Leipzig, Germany from 1898 to 1913. It's to commemorate the great victory over Napoleon, who we explored earlier this week. The attention we have towards this monument, though, is if we examine it in close detail, we see that there are many aspects of it that defy the explanation that this is truly a monument that is built to commemorate the Napoleonic conflict, or the Battle of the Nations that occurred towards the end of it. We see that there are many fine details with the figures on this monument that don't seem to match what we would expect soldiers to be wearing during the Napoleonic conflict. Indeed, we see figures wearing suits of armor, carrying swords, in direct contravention to what we're told the primary weapon being used during the Napoleonic conflict was. Now, of course, we'll be told that this is merely an idyllic representation, that this is to inspire us in the monument, to show us true commemoration of the soldiers that served during the Napoleonic conflict. Yet we have armored knights and we have what appear to be lions. We do have some construction photos of this monument to the Battle of the Nations. Yet at the same time, we have the usual challenges that we do when we examine these construction photos. Does scaffolding really prove construction? Does a big hole in the ground in some nondiscrete location really show construction? There's also an odd issuing with scaling. This monument is nearly 300 feet high, and the stones and the masonry used in it appear to be far older than what we're told. We see figures that do not match anything from the Napoleonic Wars, and we see a structure that seems to commemorate something else. Is this supposed to be some sort of monument that was built during the medieval period? Because these figures that we see depicted on this monument look as though they would reflect some great medieval battle. Perhaps the Duke of Austria or the King of the Holy Roman Empire. Yes, I know it was an emperor, but I'm just merely making fun at all the inconsistencies within the monument. It's a very impressive monument, and you see that the construction behind it is truly extraordinary. Not something we'd expect to have happen from 1898 to 1913, completed just in time before the First World War, a monument to potentially an earlier world war. Or was this really a monument to any world war that our civilization knows of? What if this was truly a monument that was actually established by the civilization that preceded ours, the Tartarian civilization? Now I know to new viewers of the channel what I'm suggesting might be absurd and it might be offensive. But when we have observations of many of the figures that we see in this monument that just don't seem to make any kind of sense, what exactly is this figure here supposed to be representing from the Napoleonic conflict? This is not anything we have any account of, and even looking inside the monument, aside from truly impressive architecture, we see figures and representations that make absolutely no sense. They do not represent directly what we visualize as the soldiers that took part in the Napoleonic conflict. Where's the very well-dressed Duke of Wellington? Where's Admiral Nelson? Where's Prussian Field Marshal Blücher? This doesn't look anything like Field Marshal Blücher, or Wellington, or anyone else who participated in the Napoleonic conflict. So ask yourselves, what's really being depicted here? Is this just supposed to be some ideal representation of what transpired in the Napoleonic conflict? Or are these figures representing something completely different? Are they representing another civilization celebrating a great victory and triumph? When you examine these figures closely, and you consider what they may be representing, the symbolism behind them, you realize that there is a very strong possibility that they are depicting something from that Tartarian civilization that preceded ours. A civilization that valued life, that valued a unified societal effort and a great struggle that they faced. Who exactly was the adversary, though? And why do we believe that this monument to the Battle of the Nations really reflects them? Well, when it comes down to it, you analyze all these figures, and it's very difficult to find any sort of symbolism that matches that particular time frame. Now, of course, the official explanation will tell us that these figures merely represented the ideal times of German artwork from the late 19th and early 20th century, and it makes perfect sense. And of course, since people worked harder and there was no other needs going on in the German Empire at that time prior to World War I, or their great effort towards colonialism, that they could afford to build a monument like this, and do it quite easily. And these figures are merely representations of all the soldiers that served in the Napoleonic conflict. You don't need to build an exact representation, much like in the U.S. Civil War monuments, of which there are so many. Ubiquitous Civil War monuments that you can find in every courthouse in the United States. They always seem to be a column, and they always seem to have some sort of figure that is attached to the top. It's rather odd, though, because it seems as though that the Civil War monuments feel as though the actual base was already established, and then there were add-ons or modifications. Now, in some monuments, this shows a little bit more than others. These monuments are always called the Soldiers and Sailors monuments, and you can find them across the land. The most prominent one that we looked at in previous explorations on this channel being the Soldiers and Sailors monument in Indianapolis, Indiana. A very impressive and tall column adorned with numerous decorations. Now, to be fair and objective, some of the decorations towards the base do appear as Union soldiers. They do reflect what we'd expect to see from the nature of the Civil War. But the larger figures and the base stones don't seem to reflect that, and the figure on top of this very impressive monument most certainly does not seem to reflect anything from the Civil War. And we look at its very questionable construction and the so-called documentation of it, and there seems to be so many difficulties in simply explaining it. We also have accounts of other Civil War monuments that, due to the changing perceptions of the time, have been modified by having the statues removed from them, as we can see in this impressive column of what used to be a Confederate monument. Yet if you just pull off the statue, what do you have? You still have the baseline column. Was there something else that was once on top of this column? Notice that they're also using a high-powered modern crane. There are many Civil War monuments across our favorite state to explore, Iowa. And the reason we say Iowa is our favorite state to explore is because that's where all the exploration started. And naturally, they have a very impressive Soldiers and Sailors monument out in front of the Iowa State Capitol as well, almost looking like you're in Rome. The Soldiers and Sailors monument in Iowa we've looked at in a very early exploration on the channel. Now, this is certainly one that is very difficult to explain because we have this statue of Iowa. This was made in the 1890s. How exactly, given what we know of the society in the 1890s, would this have been appropriate or tolerated at that time? At that time, we're told that it was very inappropriate for a lady to show even her ankle. and yet here we have full frontal nudity being depicted. Other aspects of this monument don't really make a lot of sense, such as this figure we have that looks like Julius Caesar on the back. Now, we do have Civil War soldiers and some strange portraits that are put on it, but I'm not beginning to question if this monument was modified, that they had the statues that didn't make any sense and then changed them. And this other monument that's supposedly to a leading political figure in Iowa earlier in its history, and how exactly do any of the figures on this part of the monument make sense? There's also the Sergeant Floyd Monument, yet another obelisk that's located in Council Bluffs, Iowa. This is supposed to be dedicated to a fallen member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So let me get this straight. A non-commissioned officer in the United States who died in the early 19th century has a very large obelisk dedicated to them as a monument and a memorial. Is that really what this is all about? Now, I know there's many different theories behind what obelisks could really represent and the power structure that they may represent. But for this exploration, let's just look at the fact and consider that the obelisk really is a monument. Here we actually have a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers officer with facial hair, obviously before World War I. And yet we're told that the credit for this monument, that it was done in the early 1900s to commemorate Sergeant Floyd, who had fallen during the Lewis and Clark expedition. Now, granted, it's not an impressive obelisk that's the height of the Washington Monument that we looked at, but it's still impressive nonetheless. We also have other monuments that seem to indicate some sort of victory, and on many of the triumphal arches you see figures like this. But why are we always representing Rome? Well, if we look at our 5 eras theory that we go off of on the channel as the baseline of our explorations, we can see that the Tartarian era is the era that preceded ours, or the civilization that preceded ours. They had their own period of rise and ascendancy, and then eventually their fall. We also looked at the Reset War, which occurred after that civilization that preceded ours fell, and the Reset War was a conflict that was designed to destroy the remaining enclaves of the previous civilization. When we look at the Tartaria or 4th era civilization's timeline, we see that it had 3 distinct phases: a rise, an ascendancy, and a decline. That decline came with a large battle that they had lost, or a significant conflict. We believe that that conflict was against the same adversary that they had faced earlier in their civilization and had defeated. In this exploration, we're looking and positing that all these monuments were in recognition of this adversary they defeated. And who was this adversary? Well, we've looked at it before when we did the exploration on ancient evil. We have serpents that are represented in many of these monuments. We have serpents that are represented as a force of evil. And we certainly have the subculture of snakes or serpents representing evil. Now, do I want to be against snakes and say that you need to kill a snake if you come across it? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. We're merely considering the symbolism here. But we have symbolism from many different aspects that show that for whatever reason, the serpent represented the adversary that the previous civilization faced. Also, think on the nature that we're told of the serpent. The ability to deceive, the ability to change people from the inside and corrupt them. That seems to be what the serpent represented. So whoever this adversary was that Tartaria faced, they certainly had all kinds of unique abilities to change people from the inside out, and perhaps they even had the ability to change the shapes of their own physical forms. We just don't know. We still see aspects of the serpent that endure to this day in various belief systems across the land. We also look at how the representation of the serpent factors into many of our fantasy stories that we're told have no basis in fact and absolutely have no historical foundation. Yet we can't ignore the fact that the aspect of the serpent is constantly depicted and used in many different stories, from Conan the Barbarian to the revived He-Man series, which interestingly enough was quickly canceled once they decided to depict a race of serpents that they fought, and even Snake Mountain becoming a giant serpent god. Now that could all just be a coincidence, but I find it very fascinating that a popular cartoon that was used for marketing was suddenly no longer popular and pulled off the air very quickly. Again, it could just be a coincidence. There are depictions of serpents and what they represent in all cultures from all times, from our contemporary era. We view the serpent with a sense of trepidation. And of course, there are many people who seem to have a natural, almost instinctive fear of serpents or snakes. Yet not all the time is the depiction or use of serpents negative. In the alternative, there seems to be a very positive depiction of serpents that can be seen with different societies, that they represented power and the ability to achieve power. However, looking at most of the representations, they seem to show a very powerful and capable adversary that had to be overcome. We look here at these reliefs in Riga and Latvia, and we see some very serpent-like qualities in this dragon creature. And indeed, dragons were also referred to as serpents or great worms. Many of these figures here in the same city, showing what appears to be some sort of serpent adornment. Is it possible that these were compromised human beings from the previous civilization? Were they changed in some sort of fundamental way, and this created a different segment within the previous Tartarian civilization that fought against it? Perhaps this was the enemy that they had to fight and overcome, and this was the great victory that they won. Until, as we suspect, the adversary changed their tactics and tended to be much more successful as they did so. It's hard to say, but at the same time, you can find this symbolism all over the land, from many different cultures, or at least so we're told. But do we really see these as different cultures? Or are all these symbols, or all these pictures, all these reliefs, very, very similar in how they're depicted? And what are the odds that all these symbols, all these reliefs, and all these depictions would look exactly the same across timelines and across many different civilizations? Because you can see that in many different civilizations they represented the serpent as some sort of divine being. Of course, the question always comes down to, was this a positive or a negative depiction? And to be frank, you can see both. The reliefs in Riga also show something else, a power of a lion, the power of the sun. There are many different symbols, and we will be exploring Riga in due time. It's quite an interesting location. But for right now, we're just taking a look at what we see. And in the symbols, it's almost as though we see a little bit of a conflict being represented. A conflict of almost two segments of humanity, or perhaps an uncorrupted segment of humanity against a corrupted segment of humanity. It's really hard to say. Yet we see some of the familiar symbols that we've seen in other explorations that we've done. We always see the lion, and the lion's always in a position of power. We've also seen this helmet before, and this helmeted figure, and it's in the most unlikely of places on a building that we're told was Art Deco in New York State. And yet even more interesting figures that could perhaps depict something that was far more advanced. Is this a being? Is this just an artistic representation? What exactly is this relief truly of? There's no shortage that we have, though, of triumph figures, or figures that are depicted on arches of triumph. And usually you'll have the same consistent images or statues. We have a horse. We have what typically tends to be a woman wearing a wreath or a laurel around the head. Sometimes we even have angelic wings. What exactly is this supposed to represent? And why exactly do we see this symbol depicted so frequently everywhere that we look? We're always told that the laurel wreath was usually the Roman symbol of victory and oftentimes worn during the so-called Roman triumph. But did the Romans really exist as we think or believe them to have existed? And yet, looking in other forms of symbolism that we have across the land, we can still see the power that was depicted in both eagles and lions. And interestingly enough, we're told that the so-called Roman civilization venerated the eagle, the aquila as they called it, that their legions carried. But what if this was merely a subversion of what really happened? What if the previous civilization did use eagles and lions, in addition to the often seen griffin, to represent an animal of power, to represent their unified strength when they engaged this terrifying adversary? We even have depictions such as Perseus decapitating Medusa and holding the head up high, and this was most certainly not an easy task. We have numerous depictions of lions and eagles fighting and defeating snakes, and in nearly every depiction that you see, it is the lion or the eagle that is victorious. That with the full power of the previous civilization, the adversary stood no chance against it. But we believe that the adversary changed their tactics and subverted the previous civilization, suddenly making the people believe that their great heroes were actually villains, and they began to decay and destroy themselves from the inside out. It might seem like it's not a plausible explanation, yet at the same time, we can see that in our current civilization, division and strife are the very things that seem to be constantly reinforced in every segment of our current society. But looking at all the depictions, we can see that there was a civilization, there was a time where they seemed to be far more unified in purpose. And it was through that unification in purpose that we see in all this symbolism that they were able to achieve a great victory over the adversary that they had faced in the Fourth Era. Other aspects that you consider when you look at many of these reliefs and many of what is represented in these statues is to realize that this was not an easy battle. Oftentimes we see that this was a life or death struggle, and perhaps this represented what the previous civilization truly faced. Now, it's true, these monuments, these statues, these paintings, all these depictions could simply be a coincidence that all these symbols represent different things from different cultures across different times. And once again, you have to ask the question, just how many coincidences are we actually looking at and accepting for the account that we have of history to be exactly accurate and correct? How difficult was this struggle the previous civilization faced, and if it really was the great triumph that we see, and we see many triumph arches all across the land, the arches of triumph, showing the wondrous architectural capabilities, while at the same time reflecting the achievements of that previous civilization. Now, could these remaining monuments have been altered over time with all the so-called renovations that we witness? That the symbols, at least some of the symbols that could be changed, were changed to potentially give us a different perception, or to try to reflect to us that there were many different civilizations that just happened to have a appreciation for one root previous civilization. I find that explanation very difficult to believe. I find it very difficult to believe in the fact that everybody wanted to emulate the great architectural achievements of Rome and Greece, and they kept doing it all the way to the end of the 1800s. How exactly does that make any sense? Or does it make more sense that all of these stunning monuments and architectural achievements that we see, all of these symbols, the reason there is so much recursion in them is because they were produced by that civilization that preceded ours. That these civilizations had their monuments, and they produced their monuments to reflect their great achievement of winning a very difficult conflict. A conflict that required their society to truly be unified. You have to ask yourself these questions. What truly makes sense? And if it doesn't make sense, how exactly do you explain it? You always ask the 5 W's, the who, what, where, when, and why. And after you ask those 5 W's, then you have to ask how. And if it's not easy to answer those questions, and if you notice inconsistencies, then you have to ask more questions, and you have to keep exploring. Because the answer tends to elude us if we just accept whatever simple explanation that we're given, even if it makes no sense whatsoever. Such as this wonderful monument being constructed in 24 minutes, which someone may try to tell us. And do we believe it, or do we question it? It's ultimately up to us how far we want to go with these explorations, and if we're really seeking answers. It's not easy. It's certain to say that the path of least resistance is just to accept exactly what you've been told. To accept that there are legitimate reasons for all of these monuments looking the same, for all this architecture appearing the same, even though in some cases between the cultures that constructed them there's 1,000 years, and what we're told is half a world away of distance. So how exactly does that make any sense when you really consider it? I believe that these monuments that we're looking at, the reason that they're so similar is that they did come from the civilization that preceded ours. As a little bit of a bonus, I wanted to take a closer look at the Cathedral Basilica in St. Louis, Missouri. When we explored the basilica on the ground, I didn't really have the chance to stay inside and really look at all the symbolism that we had within the very impressive cathedral. We can see here at the altar we have what looks to be a smaller dome. Now remember the size and immensity of this building. I also wanted to take a close look at the mosaics or the paintings, because what do they really represent? We're told that this is a very impressive Catholic cathedral basilica in St. Louis. Are these figures supposed to be the wise men, the apostles? There's many unique paintings and drawings and figures that adorn the domes, the walls, the arches, all the impressive structural achievements of this unbelievable edifice. Here, looking up in the dome, we see what appears to be angelic figures. We also have what we would expect to be the representation of Jesus, and yet at the same time we see other figures on the inside of the dome and under the dome. What exactly is this supposed to represent? Some aspect of the Holy Spirit within the individual? The more you look, it seems as though you get more questions, because these are very interesting depictions. Is this something from Ben-Hur, even though this cathedral basilica was constructed well before that film came out? At least so we're told, although I suspect it was constructed very long before Ben-Hur ever came out. Looking here over at this particular dome, they seem to represent more modern aspects within this painting. Yet we see many structures that are depicted on the wall as well. Is that showing some sort of development? Or is that chronicling something that came in a civilization before us? Because you look and you see some of the structures that are depicted in the painting. And what exactly do these symbols represent? And I'm sure there'll be many who will tell me that these are simple Catholic representations and that they represent the ultimate form of piety in Catholicism. And that's fine, and I could accept that. But I have to look at these figures, I have to look at these depictions and really ask what exactly is being depicted. Is this really showing us what we're told? Well, here it may, and I do suspect that there are tenets of our major religions in our current civilization that do have their origin in our very distant past. So, could we have constructed parts of it, changed it, decorated it? Yes. But are there portions of it that have been there a very long time? Will pour out my spirit on all flesh. I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. What exactly is this representing? And what does it truly mean? Both the saying and the depiction. Now, I have some familiarity with Catholicism, but that just defies what I'm aware of. Maybe somebody out there can help me in the comments. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we're going to complete our last exploration on Tartaria as a whole. In the past, we've looked at the greater glories of Tartaria. We've explored what it may have looked like, and these are just theories because the reality is we have no idea exactly what it looked like. But we have a good idea of what it may have looked like based on the remaining architectural examples that we have that endured to our own civilization in the 5th era. And yet, for whatever reason, the civilization of the 4th era, what we call Tartaria on this channel, is a civilization that we find very alluring. We also find that many of the greatest achievements in humanity and its history seem to be reflected in Tartaria, and the actual intention behind this civilization, which was to achieve balance within the individual, but also to achieve balance between the individual, the cities, and nature. It's certainly something that we can see in our current civilization, that we tend not to have balance. At least not a balance that we can recognize. We oftentimes see ourselves being moved to polar opposites on any and every issue, whether it's the differences in our ideology or our appearances or even our economic systems. And as a result of our deference to this type of conflict, we see our civilization in ruins. We see the ruins of the previous civilization of Tartaria. We know that it was a great civilization that had achieved wondrous heights, a unity of purpose within humanity. But how exactly did it fall? In the past, we posited who was truly responsible, and we came to a little bit of a conclusion that perhaps we were responsible, or at least our progenitors were responsible. Yet, looking deeper into the history of Tartaria, I think we can still see the very forces and their effects in our current civilization that caused the fall of the previous civilization. If you think about what every civilization aspires to be and do, it's to grow and to increase in size and knowledge. And while the people of Tartaria looked within themselves, they sought more lands to explore. There are accounts and myths that they opened portals to other lands, that they attempted to access areas that they didn't have access to. In effect, they had reached the physical boundaries of their realm or their lands, and they sought to explore others. It was in this exploration, though, that they opened a portal to a dark land, and they allowed some other dark beings to reach their land through this portal. By the time that they had realized what they had opened up, they found themselves facing an entity with a power that they couldn't even begin to imagine. An entity that seemed to reflect some sort of anti-deity, or an anti-god, if you will. This anti-god quickly filled the land and turned the people of Tartaria against themselves. But how was this achieved? What happened that caused the great civilization that was unified in purpose, that had achieved balance, to completely fall apart and ultimately be destroyed? We can still see the remnants of Tartaria everywhere we look across the lands. Castles, ruins, some buildings that are kept in better shape than others, and even older remnants of the buildings of previous eras. When we look at our 5 eras theory, we start with our contemporary era because that's where we are now. And we examine all of the aspects of our contemporary era. People will tell you that some things don't apply to Tartaria and some things do, but the reality is everything does. Because we are descended, we are the progeny of the civilizations that came before us. It doesn't matter if there were 4 resets, 5 resets, or 2,000 resets. We are still the same people. It's safe to say that there have been vast changes within both ourselves and our civilization and the society. When we look at the 4th era, the Tartarian civilization, we examine their great triumph. But now we're going to look at the decline and fall. How did this great civilization erode and disintegrate, ultimately turn upon itself, and then found itself isolated and destroyed by the forces that it had exposed itself to in its attempts to explore new lands, to access other lands? And we can see the great tragedy of the destruction of the once great examples of architecture. And we can see the remnants of it, even perhaps in some of the images that we have that perhaps were not altered from the 19th century. The height of the 4th era, or the Tartarian civilization, is something that we believe dreams are composed of. It's very difficult to properly imagine or visualize exactly what these images were in this civilization. The finest examples of architecture and society working together, people achieving balance, looking inward for internal strength, and most importantly, possessing self-discipline. What we know as our paradigm in our current civilization is that we have external discipline. In other words, external institutions, individuals enforce discipline upon us. We do not seek to be self-disciplined. We tend to be discouraged from seeking self-discipline. And what this leads to is when you rely on another force, authority, or individual to impose discipline upon you, it means that that entity is ultimately dictating how you're going to live your life. They're going to tell you what's important, and they're going to do it in the most insidious ways possible. Even though you may be consciously aware of it, even though you may see it, and you write about it and you lament about it every day of your life, you're oftentimes willing to accept it because you've been conditioned to accept it. You've been conditioned that there can be nothing better in the past, or that in the past everything just fell apart because the previous civilization was corrupt. And indeed, a lot of what we're allowed to or encouraged to explore when it comes to a previous civilization was the ways in which it was corrupt. Because you'll see that the corruption is reflected in our current civilization, and even in our supposed recorded mainstream account, you will find the examples of corruption. Yet contrast that with what we see as the dream of Tartaria, or the Fourth Era civilization. And that dream is a people who had self-discipline, who had self-restraint, and yet at the same time achieved balance. They were able to overcome their physical differences and all the other differences and live in a state of balance. Now, of course, this has to be mocked, this has to be derided, because this is a threat to the current power structure that we have in our Fifth Era civilization. No one is supposed to know that they have greater capabilities as an individual, that they have spiritual strength which cannot be matched in any way, shape, or form. Yet looking at the examples that we have of the Fourth Civilization, with the great achievements in architecture, we'll be told that somebody else had to do this. It was a divine being, or it was some form of artificial intelligence, which nowadays seems to be a substitute for a divine being for many. And if that's what you choose to believe, then so be it. But we have to remember that many of the greatest works of art that depict the wonders of the past came from a human being. It came from a human's creative inspiration. The tales of fantasy did not come from some artificial intelligence. They came from human creativity, the spirituality within every single human being that no doubt comes from some sort of divine power. And while I may not have spoken of it directly in the past in the channel, I've certainly alluded to it. And the reality is, our search for understanding and who we are comes from within. It does not come without. And ultimately, that was the great mistake. That was the mistake that was made in the past that led to the eventual destruction and downfall of Tartaria. When you look at all the myths and all the examples of what may have been in the past, even that does not match the grandeur for what was in reality. Because we can look across the lands and we can see great examples of horrific destruction in Siberia, in the northeastern portion of Siberia. And we'll have a designated historical account that'll tell us what was there, and will tell us about the great kingdoms that were there. But I don't believe that at the height of its civilization that a person, a citizen of Tartaria, the civilization, or whatever it was actually called, because remember that we just use that name as a placeholder because we don't know what language they spoke. We don't know what exactly they called their civilization or how they divided their lands, and perhaps they didn't divide their lands at all. They didn't believe in such a concept. It's always interesting when you look at the concepts of certain cultures that we're told believed in boundaries on land, but then conversely we're told that they did not believe in the boundaries of land, that land had now boundaries, that land was for everyone. Now you might be arguing, well, how could anybody live in such a system where there's no division? Well, somehow we manage to live in cities now where there's no actual division, although we believe there's a division of ownership. Is it real, or is it just what we accept? These are all questions that we have to explore. We also look at the concept of Camelot and King Arthur and the legend of Excalibur. I believe that that particular myth alludes to what was very likely the last legitimate regime of Tartaria, or the civilization that preceded ours. It was not based upon one person's vanity, or one person acting as king. Yes, there was King Arthur, but King Arthur didn't see himself as some sort of divine monarch. What he ultimately saw himself as was a person who worked for the betterment of the entire civilization. That was indeed the very crux of the idea of the Round Table. That everyone was equal, no one was above any other, and that the role of being the leader was simply a function. It was not some sort of near divine being that was to be worshipped. Ultimately, Arthur sacrificed himself for what was and the dream of what could be. And it's those very words that we have to remember. Things were once very great in the past, and they could be very great in the future. The way things were subverted was by kings and titles. Once the entity that managed to infiltrate Tartarian civilization, or the Fourth Era civilization, grabbed hold, one of the first things it seemed to do was to subvert individuals. And where that started was many individuals taking the title of king. How much do we value the title of king? How much do you see the use of king this and king that? King Charles, King Henry, King Charles the Simple, King Charlemagne. It goes on and on. Although Charlemagne had himself declared emperor, it doesn't really matter, because what you have is this obsession almost with titles. Now, before anybody says that I'm degrading anybody who puts value in titles, that's not what I'm saying at all. But what I'm saying is that when you embrace the importance of titles, you have to be cautious, because before you know it, you are suddenly putting the certification of a larger group on your own self-value. In other words, the titles that endure to this day. I remember there was a political science teacher during his class who was explaining to his students that we don't use titles in the United States anymore. For example, you would call me Lord Schmidt if we still use titles. And then one of the students quite accurately quipped, "Ah, yes, but we still have to call you Dr. Schmidt." Everybody got a good chuckle out of that, including myself. But what it says, though, is that if you value titles over your own individual value, then you're letting someone else dictate what your value is. And that is not what life is about. We dictate our own value. And no matter how many people try to tell you fallacies, how many people try to convince you that they're doing the right thing, or whoever dresses up in kingly robes with their wonderful adornments and decorations, there really is no difference between one human being or another. And one of the other things that caused the Fourth Era civilization to fall apart was not just the embracing of titles and indulgence in self-vanity. It was also the change in identity. What we saw was suddenly a more increased political division, a geographical division within the lands, dividing up the lands into many different principalities, and suddenly changing the ways in which they were facilitated, and even embracing the concept of being governed. If you have a people who are self-disciplined, what need is there for governance? But if you have a people who are not self-disciplined and have to be disciplined by an external force, then you have every great need for governance, which involves individuals taking the titles of king and dressing up in all the pageantry that you can imagine, with flowing robes and very nice tights. And we have room for queens too, or it doesn't really matter. Anybody can call themselves a king. It doesn't matter what your gender or your background is, or it's interesting how it even transcends cultures, that pretty much anybody can be declared a king for any point in time, or an emperor. And indeed, many of the symbols of this endure to this day. So what you have that's been effectively undermined, and what was no doubt effectively undermined in the Fourth Era civilization, was the concept of leadership. Instead of a leader seeing themselves as a servant of the people, they looked to themselves as divine beings. The defense forces of Tartaria were subverted as well. Now, I've long had an exploration looking into the military orders that we have of the medieval period, and not just focused on Europe, but all the other military orders across the lands. Yet, we can see a great example in the military orders that we believe are associated with Europe, even though they operated extensively in what is today the Middle East, such as the Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights, the Knights Hospitaller, all the other military orders that we have. The one that tends to get the most attention, though, is the Knights Templar. What we're told about the Knights Templar in our official history is that they were a military order that was founded for the Crusades, for the European or the Latin nations, as they were called at that time, to recapture the Holy Land for Christendom. And in their foundation, though, we seem to have views of chastity, views of poverty, and that they were specifically dedicated to their mission. But the Knights Templar, unfortunately, according to the official account, decided to embrace the concept of wealth, and that they were, in effect, one of the early banking systems, at least according to the official history, that presided over Europe, and as a result of which they were targeted and destroyed by the monarch of France, again according to the official history. And yet, if we look at how they operated, the Knights Templar, if they had stayed true to their original vows, what was closer? What was closer to the original concept of the once great military that defended Tartaria or the Fourth Era civilization? I believe it was the original vows and concepts of chivalry. And I've noticed that when you study this, when you study the official historical account of medieval history, you'll be told that knights only applied chivalry to noble ladies and nobility. They didn't apply it to anybody else. But what if it did apply to everyone? What if the reality was the concept of chivalry, the concept of humility, of actually embracing and defending others, did universally apply to everyone? How much does that change these military orders in our eyes, if that's what they were truly about? And over time, they became subverted. Much in the same way that the leaders of Tartaria were subverted, these knights became subverted and suddenly began to embrace the importance of material possessions, and not just money, but even the idea of money. Strangely enough, the very same things that we contend with every day. Now, I'm not saying that the concept of material possessions in and of themselves are bad. Like everything else, it's how we deal with things. If we allow ourselves to be consumed by anything, whether it's material possessions, love, or anything, it can cause us to do things that we would not do otherwise. Because suddenly we start to value the idea of this over our own self-discipline. We lose our self-identity. And if you look at the things that we contend with every day, it seems as though everything is directed towards keeping us from understanding our true selves. And this is very true when we look at the official historical account of the Knights Templar. This is a military order that had a very noble purpose and seemed to have a very noble method, a methodology behind how they lived true to that noble purpose and those values. Indeed, the Knights Templars are viciously derided as evil, or the antagonists, in the novel Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. You might remember we looked at the Scott Monument when we did our exploration in Scotland. It's a very striking monument that supposedly depicts characters. This is the original depiction of the Knights Templar. 2 knights riding 1 horse, and the reason being because they were impoverished. That was one of their essential vows. Very similar to the Franciscan monastic order in Christianity, that they embraced poverty. And yet there is a conflicting account that says that these Knights Templar devolved into concepts of violence, and they believed in violence and engaging in acts of violence, and that became more important to them, in addition to their valuing the idea of money above all else. And you can find a similar account with the Teutonic Knights, who supposedly took in the remnants of the Knights Templar and then continued their so-called colonization efforts into what is today Prussia. It's very interesting, and this is all the official historical account. Yet, again, there are conflicting accounts that say that these military orders once had a more noble purpose, that knights truly did live true to the concept of chivalry, and that it didn't just apply to a select few in the population, but it applied equally to everyone. So what's reality and what's merely the blended fiction? It's hard to say. And that's all by design. We're not supposed to have a clear account of the civilization that preceded us. Indeed, you're encouraged, and it's quite okay to talk about the Knights Templar once they had devolved. There's an interesting episode of Robin of Sherwood, yes, that show again, that I think tells the entire story of the Knights Templar in one single episode. It's called 7 Poor Knights from Acre. And in that story, Robin Hood and his band of outlaws come across a group of Knights Templar, 7 knights, who had a small object, a gold object that was a depiction of the order of the Knights Templar stolen from them by this individual. As a result of this, the Knights Templar seek to find the individual responsible, kill him, and then reacquire their material item that supposedly means everything to their honor. And in the process of doing so, they kill many innocent people trying to retrieve this object, and they even kill a member of Robin's band. And Robin himself has to actually engage in hand-to-hand combat, single combat with one of the knights to try to save one of the other members of his band. It's a very well-written story, and it's very interesting how within an hour they managed to summarize the exact progress of the Knights Templar. How they went from being a monastic order that was dedicated to the defense of a society to an order that was self-serving. Supposedly it was about their honor, but the reality is it was about the material item that had monetary value. That's why they went on this little quest near Nottingham, and why they killed innocent people, and why they attempted to terrorize Robin Hood and the outlaws. They even ran afoul of the sheriff and Guy of Gisborne, although the sheriff, acting on his own opportunistic notions, tells Guy to stand down and allow the Knights Templar to hunt Robin and the band of outlaws. Because why do it when they could have someone else do it for them? In the end, Robin Hood prevails, and I didn't understand it at first, but I do now. The knights are stripped of the armor, and then they're sent off on one horse. And you can see that the two knights here, without their armor, do actually reflect what's supposed to be the ideal concept for the Knights Templar. Two knights riding on one horse. I'd missed that when I initially viewed the episode, but upon rewatch for this exploration, I saw the truth in that. And that's what it reflects. It doesn't just reflect that truth for military orders, leaders, or monastic orders. Consider that Tartaria was carved into successor states, ruled by kings. And these are the aspects of Tartaria we're supposed to talk about. And you'll find 3 greater Tartaries or Tartarias all over the map in many different locations. We also have the accounts of madness that gripped the previous civilization. And there's no doubt that there were some people who tried to live true to the values of self-discipline, and they ran afoul of the compromised leaders and military orders, some of which who still acted in accordance with the rules of the old civilization, and others that didn't. And this is likely why we have these accounts of all these strange sicknesses, such as the dancing plague and many other bizarre accounts from our supposed incorruptible mainstream historical account. But I do think there's a lot of truth to this. There is a lot of truth into the history that we are able to see. But what seems to be the consistent reality is that we're only supposed to see the previous civilization as being a failure. We're supposed to question ourselves, and we're supposed to feel helpless, and the last thing we're ever supposed to develop is a sense of self-discipline, a sense of the ability of exploring ourselves and finding our own spiritual strength from within. You need to rely on other institutions. You need to have other people tell you what to do. When you look at how the lands were carved up and divided politically, you notice that as maps become newer, these political boundaries become more prevalent. They're a lot easier to see. Why is that? Why is it on older maps it seems as though there are no true political boundaries? Why do these accounts of mass insanity and hysteria seem to increase in certain times? What makes more sense? Was there really just all these isolated incidences of mass panic going on? Or was it really a population that was trying to struggle to find itself, to understand why their entire civilization was collapsing, why the leaders that they had trusted had suddenly turned against them, and were constantly keeping them turned against one another? Why was the great defense force that they had once relied on suddenly turning to materialism and not living true to the values that they always had? It had to be a very frightening experience for them, and no doubt many did try to find their way back to their own self-internal images, and yet at the same time, they found the people that they had relied on turning against them. And it's safe to say that this mentality, this primary method of operation, continues to this day. It is very easy to keep people turned against one another, and you can find any variety of reasons to turn people against one another. And I have no doubt that even in the grand heritage of the previous civilization, that some groups were told that they were more responsible for the achievements than other groups. It's another way. It's more of a positive way that you can turn people against one another. You can say that some people are more responsible for others for achievements than others. You can then say that those people who are not more responsible are the outcasts from society. They're people who shouldn't be listened to. You can use any number of means to reinforce this. You can use financial incentives, you can use patronage, and you'll see it every day. And no doubt this has been with us longer than we can begin to imagine. That is how the previous civilization ultimately collapsed. How it broke down into successor states, corrupted by the very forces of evil, corrupted from the inside and the outside, disintegrating and eroding, until finally it became vulnerable. Vulnerable by the very forces that it had unfortunately encountered. In its exploration for more land to explore, they had unleashed a great evil. An evil that destroyed them from the inside. And there's no doubt that there are concepts of this evil that remain with us to this day. and you don't have to look very far or very hard to see examples of it. Can it be overcome? Well, the reality is, it's still unchanged from when King Arthur said it. Defend what was and the dream of what could be. There is still a very powerful dream of what could be. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Ruins across the landscape that give us clues that there was a once great civilization that encompassed the entire world. The civilization that we refer to as Tartaria. The civilization that preceded ours. And while we may not know its actual name or what language they spoke, we know that this civilization existed, found in the wondrous ruins that dot the landscape. Indeed, many still in use today by our current civilization. But how did this wondrous civilization fall? What was the final chapter in its true history? Today we are going to explore that when we look at the final conflict of Tartaria. The legacy of Gog-Magog, Tartaria's final conflict. In the Five Eras theory, we posit that there were several civilizations that preceded our own. There may have been 4, there may have been 5. These civilizations were destroyed by what we consider hard resets, and then the civilization had to begin again. Were these natural disasters, or were these artificially induced disasters that destroyed these civilizations? In the 4th era Tartarian civilization, we see that it had 3 phases: a rise, an ascendancy, and a decline and a fall. During its ascendancy, we believe that it won a great conflict against some unknown external enemy. We've posited at the locations and origins of this potential enemy. Yet in this exploration, we're going to consider the final conflict that Tartaria faced, which brought about the downfall of this wondrous civilization, this civilization that managed to build incredible structures all across the land. Cities that were built on top of the ruins of previous civilizations that we call the Foundation Eras. The Five Eras theory explains the fact that we do have deep structures with many foundations and many structures that are built on top of the remnants of previous structures. But there may have been many more eras. Indeed, the many memorials that we see across the land. Were these really memorials to national achievements, as we're told, great conflicts that we know of in our official history? Or are the other symbols that we see that don't make sense to us representative of something else? A great victory that Tartaria won in its first conflict during its civilization. Perhaps that explains why we see all these discrepancies with what we would think of as Civil War monuments or other great conflicts that we're told of in our history. Memorials that were simply repurposed and redesigned to reflect the achievement of Tartaria. And yet, Tartaria faced an adversary that it could not possibly overcome. The legacy of Gog-Magog. Gog-Magog, it has a biblical reference to it, although, oddly enough, it appears in multiple religions, mythology, or official history, or scriptures, or whatever you want to call them. Gog-Magog represents an evil force, originally referring to 2 individuals, and yet in many of the maps of the Mappamundi and the history of the Middle Ages, we're told that Gog-Magog represented an entire force of individuals. Perhaps it was this sort of external threat that faced Tartaria that they were unable to contend with. Or maybe it refers to the fact that many individuals within their own defense forces, this civilization's great leaders, who were corrupted or subverted by the external forces that had somehow been unleashed on their civilization. Or perhaps it was merely the same adversary that Tartaria's predecessors had faced, and now they had returned to exact their revenge on the people of Tartaria. Initially, their first conflict was unsuccessful. The unified peoples of Tartaria were unable to be overcome. Therefore, this invasion force, this external threat, had to change their tactics. And we have accounts of Gog-Magog being people who were completely and totally uncivilized, and perhaps not even human beings in many ways, shapes, or forms. We even have accounts that they were individuals who were cannibals and did not recognize the precepts of society. Whatever the reality is, we have many maps from the Middle Ages that indicate that the invaders of Gog-Magog were confined to a particular geographical area. And indeed, the residents and the denizens of Tartaria were threatened, as it seems as though these ruthless attackers were unrelenting in their efforts to completely destroy the people. But we just don't know if this was simply an external threat or if this was something that attacked Tartaria from two sides, externally and internally, as we do have accounts of individuals who were corrupted by the influences of Gog-Magog. There's also the account of Alexander the Great, the hero, at least the hero when it comes to contending with the threat of Gog-Magog. Gog-Magog, the nation with uncivilized individuals that was destroying all the other civilized peoples of the world at that time. And maybe Alexander the Great represents Belisarius and Lucius Aurelian, leaders who we're told have a place in history but may in fact have been the final leaders of the great Tartarian civilization, trying to defend it from the unrelenting attacks from the threat of Gog-Magog. Many of the maps that we have from the Middle Ages, or the Mappa Mundi, indicate that the threat of Gog-Magog was confined to a geographical area. They were trapped by walls and natural terrain features that were reinforced by obstacles. There are many different biblical references from both Christianity and Islam that indicate the actions of Alexander the Great and the threat faced by Gog-Magog. Very odd for something that only came from one particular area of the land that it's referenced by multiple civilizations and multiple religions in our current civilization, giving the indication that perhaps there's a lot more to these origin stories and this threat of Gog-Magog than simple mythology or simple fantasy. When we look at many of the images and the accounts, we see various efforts by the people led by Alexander, the remnants of the Tartarian civilization, to attempt to safeguard their civilization by building walls and building forts and building outposts that would survive this attack. What we don't know is if this attack from Gog-Magog came before or after what we consider the Great Reset event. There might have been a series of disasters that befell Tartaria, and they turned to their final great commanders to try to defend and safeguard their civilization. We know that their efforts failed over time, and yet we still have the remnants of their fortifications. We're told of great walls built across the land, and indeed the Gates of Alexander, which exists to this day in the Caucasus Mountain region, may have been an attempt to try to forestall this attack, this invasion by these forces of Gog-Magog, this nation that had no civilized rules, that seemed to be unrelenting in its efforts to destroy the people of Tartaria. And when we look at the maps that we have, we can even find the natural passes through the mountains of the Caucasus. We're told that the Gates of Alexander fall right here, where there's reinforcing fortifications on the natural mountain passes. Although for all we know, perhaps the original mountains themselves may not be quite as natural as we're led to believe. When we study more of the maps of the advances of the individuals of Gog-Magog, or this terrifying nation, or whatever this external threat truly was, we can see that the walls were not successful in keeping them contained, that eventually, according to subsequent maps, they spread across the entire land, destroying every civilization that came in their way. And indeed, we do have historical accounts that try to relate this to other nations that we're told were simple hordes that crossed the land. It wasn't just the Mongols, it was also the many other forces of the Huns and the barbarian invasions. Perhaps all these refer to the same force, the original force of Gog-Magog, simply being hidden at different points in our history, with different individuals all referring to the same event. Perhaps the great leader Alexander the Great, whatever his name really was also corrupted by this influence. We have accounts and images that show Alexander the Great even working with the devil, or at least the forces of evil, to try to contain these forces of Gog-Magog. Perhaps he fell to the corruption and the influence that had overcome many of the leaders of Tartaria, and this led to the unfortunate fall and total destruction of their civilization. After they were hit by the natural disaster, or perhaps it was an artificially induced disaster, they were left at the mercy of these relentless forces of Gog-Magog. This would explain these isolated monasteries that we have, and what we view as reset compounds. Perhaps they were also survival compounds, the last-ditch attempt by a civilization that could see its end rapidly coming, trying to preserve anything and everything that they could of their civilization, their society, their true history, all that they had learned, even their architectural capabilities. And yet we know that very little of the previous civilization managed to reach ours. Indeed, to even question its existence is oftentimes ridiculed. But we can look at these subsequent maps and we can see that the remaining people of the world were the ones who were waiting for their final destruction, that the efforts of Alexander or whoever the commanders were had failed, that Gog Magog had succeeded in utterly destroying the Fourth Era civilization, or at least completing its destruction. Where do all these origin stories derive from? If we consider the Olympic opening ceremony at the Olympics in Sochi in 2014 in Russia, perhaps we have a depiction of the actual account of the fall of this civilization that preceded ours, that we call Tartaria on our channel. Now, why would we have clues that are mixed into Olympics opening ceremonies? Perhaps it's the same reason why we have so much subtext that comes into our films. There are individuals who may be aware, or at least have some sort of awareness of what transpired in the past, and therefore they attempt to integrate it, whether it's in the plot of certain films or even in a depiction in the opening ceremony of the Olympics. At Sochi, we see many interesting things of the rise of a civilization. Of course, our current mainstream will tell us that this is merely the depiction of the rise of Russia, and that this is supposed to be a Russian patriotic ceremony. And indeed, it may well be. But yet, when we look into the subtext and a lot of the symbolism of this particular ceremony, we see something that seems to allude to far more than just the rise of a single nation. Of course, we recall the fact that our current civilization seems to operate on the basic principle of division. Geographical division, division of the people, division of economic and social class. Was it always that way? It's hard to say, but when you actually go and you observe this opening ceremony from Sochi, you can see that there are many different aspects of humanity that seem to be depicted. Not something that's pertinent to one particular group of people, but perhaps something that depicts the story of us all. The unfortunate events that occurred with the last reset, where the civilization known as Tartaria was completely destroyed. Not a civilization that was confined to one particular set of lands or even one single continent, but one that encompassed the entire land, the world, all of its peoples. And when you look at some of the events that were depicted in the opening ceremony of Sochi, you can get the idea that they're really telling the entire story of humanity. It's from these depictions and these displays that we have an indication of what may have happened to the Fourth Era civilization. We have a force that seems to have come through some sort of strange portal. How exactly did this happen, we don't know the details on. But we even consider the actual Olympic ceremony with the lighting of the 5 Olympic rings, and we're told that the 5th ring didn't properly light, and it was merely a technical difficulty that bedeviled the ceremony. However, it's a very appropriate choice of words because we consider that 5th ring looks like a portal. And indeed, we did see that portal depicted in another part of the ceremony. We saw a representation that could have been the Fourth Era civilization that we call Tartaria, represented by a city here, threatened by a force that initially they were able to overcome. The Fourth Era civilization winning their initial victory when they were confronted by whatever the malevolent force truly was. And we consider that to have happened during the Ascendancy period, or the very height of Tartaria's capabilities, when they managed to achieve their greatest architectural achievements, and they had a unified civilization. We have other depictions within the ceremony that show this force coming through a portal and threatening the civilization. Now, of course, this could all just simply be interpretation by what was merely intended to be a beautiful nationalist ceremony. But yet, we're always told that's the explanation, and we have many other strange depictions at many other Olympics, not just the Olympics that occurred in Russia. So it appears as though there's much more that's actually being conveyed that may be hidden in the subtext or the details behind these elaborate opening ceremonies. we can find many representations that might reflect the greater and grander nature of humanity, a nature which we are oftentimes told to ignore or doesn't truly exist. I suggest that you watch the entire opening ceremony at Sochi and the other Olympics, and watch the opening of the Olympic ceremony at London in 2012 and many others. You'll see strange depictions. You'll see some things that do seem like they're representing the athletes and the competition that's about to occur in the manner of world unity, at least that's what we're told the Olympics represents. But when you look deeper into it, you will find a different message. You will see that they seem to be conveying something else that happened in the distant past, without actually saying it. And perhaps the Olympic opening ceremony at Sochi is most notable for what it depicted, with the aspect of a portal, a civilization initially being triumphant, and then eventually being overcome by a malevolent force. A malevolent force that managed to change its tactics and overcome what was a unified and powerful civilization, also a people who were strong internally. There's other strange aspects to the ceremony where you see the way that things are depicted and illuminated and how exactly they show a different nature of humanity. Oftentimes this is something that we do get in these Olympic ceremonies, and as mentioned before, it's not just in the opening ceremonies, it can oftentimes be found in many of the plot details of many films. Even some of the greatest science fiction films have many allusions to the old world or the previous civilization. So if this is where we derive what actually happened, then how did Tartaria's decline really come about? Clearly, there were vulnerabilities within the civilization that came about that enabled this malevolent force to overcome it, and this is what led to the final conflict and the downfall of the civilization. We consider the fact that in the Five Eras theory, we have 3 civilizations that preceded Tartaria, or the Fourth Era civilization. Now, were these civilizations that preceded Tartaria as unified, or were there other details behind them? We really don't know. And we don't really even have clues. We only have scattered legends and myths. What sort of ascendancy did they reach? How far did they come in their architectural capabilities? Or, more importantly, how far did they come in their capabilities of the individual? We have many myths and accounts, whether it's in religious texts or other means, that indicate that human beings in the distant past actually lived much longer. We're told that these are merely legends, and yet when we look around, we can see the remnants of a great civilization that had much greater capability than we can imagine. We can think on the earlier eras. Perhaps before Tartaria in the Fourth Era, there was star fort builders in the Third Era, a people who managed a tremendous architectural and geometrically precise, focused civilization. Perhaps it was much more ordered than we can imagine. And it's not to say that any one of these civilizations were completely utopian. Indeed, they all must have had their own vulnerabilities and own issues, and that's why they continue to fall. And perhaps that's what we are unfortunately forced to live, is a cycle. The cyclic repetition of the rise and fall of civilizations. Or perhaps there is a way that we can move beyond it. Perhaps there's a way we can preserve all that which we learn and not have to go through this cycle. We look at what our current civilization is, the Fifth Era as we call it. A civilization that has the hallmarks of a pseudo-civilization in many ways. In the fact that it seems to represent many of the values that we had in the past, and yet there's something about them that just don't feel as though they're completely genuine. As though we're told of wonders and greatness that we can ascend to, and yet all the time we're constantly given reasons why we just can't reach it. Why we don't have the ability to take care of all of our own people, or why we're constantly at conflict with one another. And perhaps the reasons they give us are true. Perhaps there are legitimate reasons for why we have so much division and so much conflict. Or could it be that what we experience every day is simply the remnants of what came before, or the modern and current incarnation of it? The continued division of civilizations and human beings is exactly the vulnerabilities that existed in the previous civilizations that led to their downfall. Yes, one would say there may be a lot of speculation, but I don't believe there's as much speculation as we're led to believe because of the fact that All of these accounts exist in all of our religious texts in every major society that we have across our current civilization today. So it would appear that there are accounts of that civilization reaching its ascendancy, having abilities that we can only begin to imagine to this day. How far did they really go, though, in the last civilization? Did they actually have the ability to draw power in many different ways? Did they have the ability to generate power from the air, from crystals? Did they have all their power needs met? And as a result, they managed to achieve a balanced society. In other words, a balance between an individual contributing to society and then a society that genuinely contributes to the welfare of an individual. Perhaps it's all just a dream, something that cannot actually be achieved. Or maybe that's just what we're supposed to think. Whatever the reality, the undenied achievements of the past have to be considered, because those ruins still exist to this day. And indeed, many of those things that we call ruins, the state capitals, the opera houses, all the wondrous structures that we consider palaces, and then we consider the remnants of the star forts that we have to this day, many of which are in wondrous shape despite all that they've been through, with time, reset, and then even if we accept the mainstream's account of history, consider all the other factors of weathering and the conflicts that they've been through. And yet these structures stand to this day, many in very pristine condition, and many being used currently as government buildings or commercial buildings or any other number of uses. Also consider the infrastructure and logistical capability of the civilizations that came before us. Great airships that had unlimited capability to move vast objects and much great amount of materials across vast distances in a rapid amount of time. Clearly they had some method of energy generation or fuel consumption that was vastly superior to anything we know today. For all we know, perhaps what we use today is the surviving remnants, the derivatives of what came before. Of course, the oftentimes theme that we're given is that we are supposedly at our technological ascendancy at this point now. But is that really true? Or is the reality that we've simply declined from having much more advanced technological capability in the past? Many of the clues that we have and a lot of the evidence that we can see indicate that the civilizations that came before us actually had a greater technological capacity. We cannot replicate the buildings that were constructed in the past. We supposedly can build taller buildings, although we don't know if that's true, and supposedly we can build structures that are much more effective than the structures in the past in terms of housing larger numbers of people and caring for the needs of many people. And yet we can't build or reconstruct many of the state capitals that we have in the United States. You don't see anyone building the great opera houses or palaces that are across Europe, or whatever current designation we give these wondrous structures or edifices across the land. Yet we also consider the destruction and descent of the civilization that preceded ours. They had much greater capability, and yet they still fell. And why exactly did that happen? We've explored that on the channel, and we consider the reset event that occurred, whether it was a natural or artificially induced disaster. Was it plasma fire from the sky? Was it some sort of cymatic force that induced a mud flood and completely destroyed the soil? Was it a vast tsunami or flood? Or was it all three of these events, which eventually eroded and destroyed the civilization's capability to exist and defend itself, leaving it in a state of vulnerability? We don't know the exact details, but we have many different clues. We also consider the fact that there were no doubt survivors from these horrific events, and even from the second conflict, the final conflict that Tartaria faced that led to its final destruction, the attack of what we consider Gog-Magog. Was that really any of its names, or are these just the names that we assign to these events that we only have a recorded myth of? Something that we can't officially understand. There's nothing that's actually recorded in epic detail of what truly happened. So all we have are these vague memories, these myths, these accounts that become blurred over time, that become confused. And then, as we establish a new history with constant historical revision, which we know happens, we realize that these events become even more confused. Perhaps Aurelian and the other leaders that were represented at that time were other leaders of Tartaria who fell to the corruption, or perhaps they died trying to defend their civilization. Consider the final destruction of Tartaria, with the last siege of the remaining cities. We have many different accounts of sieges of cities and their destruction, and these are very terrifying accounts of the last remnants of people trying to fight for survival. They must have known for years or decades or perhaps even longer that their destruction was imminent, and they faced a very horrifying reality. They knew that there were many efforts that were undertaken to try to save their civilization and to try to save their cities. And yet, despite their very best efforts, they were unable to defend themselves from this malevolent force that had been terrorizing them for such a long time. And suddenly they found themselves unable to defend themselves. We even have some images that indicate that there may have been cities such as Bologna that had some other means of defense. We're told that the great towers of Bologna were a means of both offense and defense, but that doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense, unless perhaps those towers had some other capability. We also consider the works of what we're told is high fantasy from J.R.R. Tolkien, such as the Fall of Gondolin, or indeed the complete destruction of all the elven kingdoms at the end of the First Age, as he calls it. Perhaps this is synonymous, and is indeed an exact account of what happened with not just the civilization that preceded ours, but indeed the civilizations that came before them. There's a lot of myth and a lot of folklore from many different peoples across the land. And yes, we do have accounts of a more biblical sense or a more religious sense of direct evil, of devils, demons, and other creatures. And indeed, there may be details behind that may be true. And for all we know, maybe it is an exact account. We just don't know. And what to make of the so-called heroes or the leaders that tried to preserve the civilization? Were they real? Were they corrupted? Or do we just have a very vague memory of them? We have no shortage of these terrifying apocalyptic images that show the unrelenting destruction of many of these great cities. And we're told that this is merely a time during the Middle Ages when people were driven by fear and superstition. Yet they were also capable of building large cathedrals and tremendous architectural achievements that stand with us to this day. This is why we have so many difficulties with the mainstream account. Why do we have fortifications that are in very remote places in the land? Unless there genuinely was some sort of effort undertaken in the past to try to enable a civilization to survive, an unrelenting threat that had forces beyond our wildest dreams that were constantly attacking and destroying it. And it seems as though these forces of Gog-Magog, or whatever this malevolent entity really was, only grew stronger as they increased the amount of land and lives that they destroyed each and every year in their total and complete destruction of the Fourth Era civilization. The people facing terror, trying to survive, trying to find a place where they could hide or where they'd be safe. Perhaps there was even an attempt to parlay one final negotiation to try to enable some portion of the civilization known as Tartaria to survive. And while there may have been an honest attempt at a parlay or a negotiation, it was simply a ruse, simply a final ruse to bring down the last defenses of Tartaria, to leave them vulnerable for the attacking forces, which were then unleashed with their full potential, to destroy the remaining cities and to destroy the people of Tartaria, of the Fourth Era civilization that preceded ours, once and for all. And indeed, as we can attest to, everything was destroyed. Their society, their history. The only thing that remained were some of the structures, and indeed the foundation structures, perhaps remnants of the buildings that preceded them. What a terrifying time it must have been to realize that survival was not guaranteed, to realize that people would be without hope and without dreams, and their only hope was to try to live to see the next day. Oftentimes we're told that this is the lowest state of existence for human beings, and there's no doubt about it that in the previous civilizations they did face this many times. We're told in our current mainstream history that other peoples have faced this, and indeed they do to this very day. But I think it's important that we all remember that all of us in some way are connected to these survivors who underwent these trials and tribulations. That as long as there were survivors from this calamity, this downfall of civilization, there will always be hope for the future